White Gold, Meissen Porcelain and the Destruction of Dresden. Durch Grünbein's Porcelain, Poem vom Untergang meiner Stadt, Porcelain, Poem on the Downfall of My City, addresses one of the most controversial episodes of modern German history, the Allied firebombing of Dresden, and it does that through the perspective of porcelain, the white gold that made Dresden its wealth and made it a cultural capital of Europe. You can see on the cover of the German edition the crackly grey glaze effect of pottery. Here is my translation for the 75th anniversary of the bombing. Today I want to explore how these things are linked, sketching in along the way how literature has tried to come to terms with this event, how it seeks to find a language for trauma, one of the most pressing concerns of the 20th century, how it contributes to the search for a mode of modern elegy, how art is implicated in that search, and finally what it says about our habits of reading poetry. The Allied bombing of Dresden on the nights of the 13th to the 15th of February 1945 remains one of the most controversial military acts of the Second World War, and has spawned a vast historical response. This slide is a famous image by photographer Richard Peter showing the absolute devastation wrought in 2 days of bombing, an assault the ferocity of which famously created a firestorm that caused the tarmac on the streets to bubble and the water in reservoirs to boil, and led to vast loss of civilian life. Indeed, the bombing was decried by National Socialist propaganda, but crucially also in the US and even by some in the UK, as a war crime. The silhouette of Dresden as Baroque Florence on the Elbe, immortalised by the Italian landscape artist Canaletto, stood centre stage in this account and eclipsed Dresden's role as a centre of industry, garrison city, and communications hub in the popular and historical imagination. Not, however, in the mind of famously unrepentant British commander at the time, Sir Arthur Bomber Harris. The feeling such that there is over Dresden could easily be explained by a psychiatrist. It is connected with German bands and German shepherdesses. Actually, Dresden was a mass of munitions works, an intact government centre and a key transportation centre. It is now none of those things. The victim narrative, though, was crucially taken up in the official line in the new communist GDR, East Germany, after the war, as the ultimate symbol of imperialist aggression, formally dubbed the Anglo-American terror bombing, perversely enough after a phrase concocted by Goebbels, the Nazi Reichspropaganda minister. In the West too, for reasons not always entirely straightforward, people continue to invest in the sense that Dresden was a special case. It's not surprising, therefore, after German unification, that it was Dresden that became the icon of a new discourse of German suffering in the Second World War. In part, this symbolic value allowed the destruction of Dresden to become understood as a violation not only of the city itself, but of German culture per se, Dresden as Gesamtkunstwerk. However, when the writer W.G. Sebald, Max Sebald, launched his influential thesis that German post-war literature had been criminally silent on such subjects in his Zurich lectures of 1997, translated in English as On the Natural History of Destruction, Dresden was in point of fact already a glowing counterexample. Most of the now huge literature on Dresden was written by those who experienced the bombing firsthand, as adults or children, from the famous diaries of the Jewish Victor Klemperer, who escaped death through the Allied bombing, to an international bestseller like Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5, which recounts his experience of being in Dresden as a POW, albeit as part of a very strange alien adventure. Grünbein's work, published in 2005 in Germany, is the latest and one of the most controversial contributions to that literature. Born in 1962, Durs Grünbein had no direct experience of the bombing, but he grew up with the aftermath around him, both in the ruins around him and within his own family. Indeed, Greenbaum characterised his own response to the events, so often recalled by older, generally female members of his family, as phantom pain. The first poem of the book ironically foregrounds the 17 years that separate the events of February 1945 from his birth. I'll read the English, but the German is there for you too, for any who can read it. Why complain, Johnny come lately? Dresden was long gone when your little light first appeared on the scene. Moist eyes are not the same as grey hair, my son, and as your name suggests, you're too quick for it, too green. 17 years, barely a childhood, was all it took to erase what had been there before. The sombre grey of uniformity had closed the wounds, and magic ceded to bureaucracy. No need to slay the Saxon peacock. Lichen bloomed on the sandstone flowers implacably. Why brood? It comes back like hiccups. Elegy. You get a taste of it there, I think. Now, this book-length poem with 49 rhymed 10-line strophes in classical metre of a sort is Greenbaum's most sustained and personal attempt to date to come to terms with the events of 1945, set against the longer history of Dresden, in a mode that allows for mourning, but also makes plain the cultural heritage is not untouched by politics. And this is where the porcelain comes in. The poem is fascinated by the origins of porcelain in Europe. In the 17th century, Europe was enthralled to Chinese porcelain. With its pure white biscuit, its unique malleability, Asian porcelain surpassed in its finesse and craft anything known in the West, and was so pure and valuable it was even thought to have magic properties. As Edmund de Waal points out, it was so rare, so arcane in medieval Europe, that to drink from porcelain was supposed to prevent poison. European aristocracy entered into a porcelain craze, and Louis XIV even melted down the Versailles silver to pay for it. The Saxon elector, Augustus the Strong, himself bemoaned his maladie de porcelaine and spared no expense or effort to secure the sought-after pieces. He also, cannily enough, however, engaged young alchemist Johannes Friedrich Böttger, imprisoned him more exactly, until after years of experimentation he came up with the red stoneware. After that, the red clay simply needed to be replaced by the precious kaolin terra alba in the local Dresden soil that could be fired with natives' feldspar and quartz to produce the brilliant white porcelain, which has been associated with Meissen ever since. The manufactory was founded in 1710, and the famous blue crossed swords insignia guaranteed the arcanum. Greenbaum's poem celebrates the figures, dining sets, tureens, life-size figures that were created for the splendour of the Baroque court and the master ceramicists that came after. But he also makes the point that Meissen is also art in the home for ordinary Dresdeners. Every family in Dresden had their own small piece of Meissen, an heirloom which we brought out on special occasions and admired. How do these things come together? The illustrious history of Dresden's porcelain production and the destruction of the city itself. It's in that word, porcelain. The German title of Greenbaum's poem, Porcelain, carries within it a covert reference to what Greenbaum has called the secret dedicatee of his work, Holocaust poet Paul Celan. This was missed on its reception, though in fact Celan haunts the work in countless unremarked borrowings. His presence also signals the broader aesthetic and political project of the work, to place the events of February 1945 within the larger context of German aggression during the war, the destruction of Guernica, Warsaw, Coventry. But also to look at the role of art in that. The project itself is controversial. The Dresden bombing is at the centre of political campaigns by the New Right that see it as a hallmark of German victimhood, and every year the reconciliation ceremonies are met also with vociferous protests. But if it's controversial in and of itself, Grünbein also goes about it in controversial ways. Take poem 4, for example. Porcelain. Endless porcelain was ground to dust. Crockery, cups and figurines, whitest Meissen gold. But not just that. Ah, once upon a time, the faintest tinkling, then across the crime scene the thunder rolled. What a rowdy wedding do. It was the night of broken glass, or what sharp-tongued folk called the glazier's lucky day. And Ash Wednesday was just a hop, skip and jump away. Fools and Nazis, huzzah, sure, they had a blast. What's that, innocent? Disgrace came long ago. Dresden shepherdesses, German bands. Where are you now? Excuse me. On publication, critics took against the line about the Jewish pogrom being the glazier's lucky day. But in fact, the more daring leap is the way the destruction of Dresden's famous Meissen porcelain is linked to the violence inflicted on the Jewish population during the war. The sound of the porcelain segues into the smashing glass of Kristallnacht, almost like a film dissolve, making a political point about Dresden's demise being the ultimate consequences of Germany's own aggression, in symbolic terms. But the poem betrays unease in the juxtaposition even as it draws it. The movement between the November pogroms of 1938 and Ash Wednesday bombing of 1945 is nur ein Sprung in German. But this is not so much a leap, one meaning of this fatally determined word, as an uncomfortable rupture of tone. Here also embedded in the Narrensprung, the carnival dance performed as part of the culturally sanctioned overturning of orders. And a Sprung is also precisely a crack in the porcelain itself. The poem juxtaposes its wistful memory, of a golden age of cultural innocence with an era in which cultural capital operates as a fig leaf for horror. One can hear the shiver of breakage rattling through the vowels of the German. I said critics were worried. In truth, they were more than worried. The first issue was the very fact of someone born after the prominent Johnny-come-lately of the first poem, writing about what he had not experienced himself. On the one hand, Grünbein was taxed for not doing justice to the horror because he remained too distant and without emotion, too cynical. On the other hand, he was thought to be taking possession of suffering that was not rightfully his, usurping others' experiences. The work then raised in an acute form the very legitimacy of post-memorial writing. Related to this was a perceived unease at what was read as an uncertainty of tone in the poem, especially the juxtaposition of a voyeuristic fascination with violence, griddled corpses popping like chestnuts, with an excessive pathos, especially in the family stories, Grünbein's mother's own survival as a child, and kitsch in the fetishization of the porcelain. This tied in with many for a discomfort over the sexualization of Dresden, a charge that became more pointed after an interview of 2005 in English, in which Grünbein called the poem a rape fantasy. Finally, reviewers almost universally found the classicized aesthetic form incongruous and overwrought, likening it to a gilt-edged tea service with a mourning band. The classical metre incommensurate with the overwhelming material. Critics dubbed it more than once pornographic. A review by a prominent critic, Michael Braun, to which Grünbein returns in the English version, was tellingly entitled "Is There a Language for the Inferno?", raising the stakes and self-consciously connecting back to Sebald, but also further to the post-1945 discussions inspired by philosopher Theodor W. Adorno about how to find a language adequate to the Holocaust. I mention these things here because it seems to me they go to the heart of what this poem is about. Critics have too often missed the fact that the poem as a whole stages these dilemmas as a way of questioning the very premise of who can write about what and how. This is in fact placed centre stage from the very beginning, with a seemingly oblique and at first reading at least ironic reference to elegy returning as hiccups in that first poem we looked at. One of the many places where the poem references Porcelain. In his, that's Celan's poem Deine Augen im Arm, Your Eyes Embraced, Celan's lyric subject attempts to swallow the ashes representing the genocide, that they return as Aschen Schluck auf, ash hiccups. The critic Eric L. Santner argues that Celan's poem embodies Germany's failure to mourn. Grünbein here, and elsewhere, think of his first volume in English, Ashes for Breakfast, translated by Michael Hoffman, for example, suggests the same is still true. What is more, and this should not really need saying, the lyric subject of the poem should not be confused with Grünbein himself. For one, careful reading shows that many voices are overheard, spliced together and quoted here, not only poets and writers, including von Klemperer and Vonnegut themselves, politicians, myths, Nazis, and you will see in this poem, the Dresden shepherdesses and German bands, a citation from Sir Arthur Harris, and spliced with a question from David Bowie's final album. In the same way, the poem often autocorrects, testing out different approaches, criticising its own lapses in taste, as if trying out different ways of creating forms of address that might stand as a form of contemporary elegy. More than that, it does not embrace a single view of Dresden. The poem in fact explicitly thematises looking and not looking, seeing and not seeing, but also above all the issue of perspective. Poem 32, for example, sees the silhouette of Dresden drawn in cavalier perspective. Others make use of instruments, the child under museum lights with a magnifying glass, examining the famous Baroque cherry stone from the Green Vault, carved with 185 heads screaming in horror. It's a marvellous thing, not even thumbnail-sized, a stone spat out by a cherry thief, no more. As a boy I'd stare at it for hours under museum lights and magnifying glass, like a tiny planet seen from afar. Carved in hardwood, a jeweller's masterpiece, eyes wide with terror on every tiny screaming face. Inferno on a needle tip, but droplets glisten. Hard to fathom, there, in Nuce, what would come to pass. Emblem of the future and my hometown Dresden was itself that cherry pip as seen from outer space. Later, a burning glass appears in the hand of a Baroque voyeur looking under the skirts of a porcelain figurine. At another point again, it is the lens of a wedding snapper at a family wedding, which gains a further charge from being seen through a subterranean reference to a poem by Philip Larkin. Poem 22 even offers a nightmare vision of a lone statue staring helplessly out across the devastation, which seems to cite in absentia the famous image of Dresden taken by Richard Peter in 1945 that I showed you at the start. Now, you will notice that all these things are also images of Dresden through art. The same goes for the issue of sexualization. Grünbein has repeatedly called the poem impossible troubadour poetry, a love poem to Dresden. The city and art in the poem are associated always with the feminine. This trope reaches a climax in his interview in English cited earlier, in which he interprets the bombing of Dresden as a rape fantasy. But this is not Grünbein's fantasy. Instead, he cites it as part of a culturally legitimised fascination with a violation of beauty in art and literature. And Dresden is everywhere seen through the lens of art in this poem. That is captured, I think, precisely in the last line of this strophe, which depicts the bombers flying in across the river's slender S towards Dresden, across the river Elbe. The last lines: the skies of Spain are light, and Guernica and Coventry of the bella antebellum, nothing left to see. That's more than a grammatical joke, however. In a recent interview, Grünbein charts the terrible historical reality of just such attitudes in the accounts of the pilots from the Gulf War, where the sexualisation of bombing was ubiquitously documented, and projects it back onto those Allied bombers in 1945, themselves following the sinuous S of the Elbe towards their target. In Dresden, beauty was attacked. Dresden was attacked precisely because it was beautiful and defenceless, and because it was an attack on the defenceless part of European culture. It was essentially an attack on the bomber's own culture. There's a poem in my early cycle, Europa nach dem letzten Regen, Europe after the last rains, in which I describe this from the perspective of a young bomber, Las Vegas an der Elbe. Today we get pictures from the Iraq War, and you can see that it's a lot of fun to fire away at something, to shoot massive fireworks over great distances. That's the essence of bombing. You don't feel it at all. Bombers turn around after they've dropped their load. It's powerful. In fact, it's pure Baroque splendour. The dialectic is exciting, at least for a structural thinker like me. In Dresden, a Baroque work of art was staged for the last time, the last great celebratory act, the destruction of a Baroque city in Baroque proportions. No one has gauged the contradictions of the 20th century, in which a visual feast for one person can mean instant conflagration for thousands of others. A very interesting comment, I think, a difficult and powerful structural comment there, which skirts around the sexual politics in perhaps a slightly uneasy way. And there's that S, the sinuous form, which is a photograph that's included in the volume. But it's not for nothing that S also recalls the form of Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, aka the Dresden Venus, that Grünbein talks about in another essay. But also William Hogarth's Line of Beauty, described in his Practical Aesthetics of 1745, quoted in the volume, but also the runic S associated with the SS. But the destruction is then reinterpreted again, structurally, as it were, so as to move beyond the historical specificity. Once again, in Grünbein's recent Oxford lectures, published last autumn in Germany, Jenseits der Literatur, to much acclaim, he expands his thoughts on the role of aerial photography in war, to linger on a memory of his own descent into London, and render the issue again one of perspective. I can still remember the approach to London by air, which I experienced in a rare euphoria at the time on account of the glorious summer weather. The sense of promise began in the mouth of the Thames estuary. The view had been so extraordinary, the panorama of the capital so razor sharp on the horizon, that I was involuntarily put in mind of the pilots and onboard gunners of the Royal Air Force in the glass cockpits of the Vickers Wellington and the Avro Lancaster aircraft. As cool as you like, I saw the great European city appear like a target spread before me. Dreamily I had followed the Thames as it meandered towards the high-rise towers in the distance, saw the Millennium Dome, a white hedgehog, Canary Wharf and the Docklands, and recognised in the majestic course of the river, as in a film dissolve, the famous S-bend of the river Elbe, and my hometown Dresden. Not only the rivers, also our cities, bound together by war, suddenly opened up before me in all their beauty and defencelessness, from the perspective of a bird of prey, and I was, I remember, moved in an inexplicable way. The aerial view is the phantasm of false sovereignty. A key aspect of that, as I've already suggested, is this question of perspective, is the role of art, and especially porcelain. Grünbaum's poem hints at this when one of the poems has munitions disastrously hidden in soup tureens. And indeed, the Meissen factory was used for the production of arms during the war. But this aspect gains an added urgency when one remembers the role of German porcelain under fascism. The beautiful, pure white art that was hailed as the embodiment of the German soul. Goering and Goebbels ordered Meissen as gifts. Porcelain factories turned to making white Hitler busts, Teutonic maidens, stormtroopers to fund the war effort. This has all been brilliantly documented by Edmund de Waal in his The White Road of 2005 and a BBC documentary, The Secret Nazi History of Porcelain. The culmination was the founding of a porcelain factory in Dachau itself, with the inmates in a special block producing the delicate whiteware while prominent Nazis came to choose their figurines. Let me put it another way. No art is pure, and Grünbaum's poems know that and make it manifest from the start. One of the inspirations that Grünbaum mentions for this work is Czesław Miłosz's Song of Porcelain. The line from Miłosz's Piosenka o Porcelanie, written in American exile in 1947, is one of the many shards of European poetry that trouble Grünbaum's poem. The broken porcelain cups and saucers represent not only all that has been lost through the violence of war, they're at the same time a symbol of its beauty and its ruin, but also a synecdoche for the precarious transmission of cultural memory from generation to generation. But also, finally, as Jeffrey Hartman has noted of Miłosz's poem, they demonstrate the inadequacy of those fragile symbols. The failure of porcelain as a symbol to carry the weight of history is heard in the broken, even pained half-rhyme of Miłosz's refrain, Pana Porcelani, brilliantly captured in Robert Haas's translation. Of all things broken and lost, porcelain troubles me the most. Those lines are, while not quoted in Grünbaum's poem, for me programmatic for it. Grünbaum's work does not attempt to make the losses of Dresden whole, but attempts to capture the memory of wholeness and the reality of brokenness, of loss, in the language and the form itself. It also seeks to make a contribution to what can be thought of as, with all its complications, modern elegy and the fault lines that run through it. The modern elegy is a constant battle between knowledge and emotion. It has to give itself up to knowledge, and at its core it contains a contradiction between insight into the inevitable process of modernisation on the one hand and an increasing awareness of loss on the other, a contradiction that irrevocably rips it apart. That's Edmund de Waal again in his recent letters to Commando. I'll finish, as I started, with a final image that does not appear in the book, but has been helpful for me in thinking about Grünbaum's method. One of von Klemperer's own collection of porcelain dishes, bought, fire-blackened and broken by ceramicist, writer and master potter Edmund de Waal, and exhibited in the historic Japanisches Palais in Dresden, Augustus's special porcelain house, in February 2020. But the plate has been worked on by contemporary Japanese artist Maiko Tsutsumi to reassemble the shards using the traditional kintsugi method, that is, mending with gold lacquer so that the mend is visible and the artwork can be appreciated with its history. That is to say, the gold lacquer marks a moment of rupture, a moment of loss, and makes apparent both the fact of the artistic dialogue across the ages, but also places the object within a historical time span that goes beyond the life of the artist and the present of the object itself. Grünbaum's porcelain as kintsugi, then? Maybe, I'm not sure. The shards of history turned in the hand of the poet, and worked with words to become an object that bears its historical scars, but speaks to the present. Thank you.